Hey guys, today we confront a geography that defies all common sense. Imagine a city with virtually no land, no mines, no forests, and no great army forged from solid ground. It was built upon mud, salt water, and silt, standing in the middle of a desolate, windswept lagoon. By every logic, this place should never have existed, much less flourished. Yet, for a millennium, this improbable location became one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations on Earth. Today, we will tell the epic, almost mythological story of the Republic of Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene republic. How did they do it? How did a republic of merchants, living in a swamp, construct a vast maritime empire? How did a city with no natural resources become the undisputed gateway between East and West? We will explore the genius of their shipbuilders, sail with their fleets into the heart of the Crusades, and follow their traders as they monopolize the world's most lucrative silk and spice trade. This is a story of extraordinary ingenuity, ruthless political drama, and an iron will forged by the sea. The story of Venice begins not with a grand design, but with a desperate, fear-driven flight. By the 5th century AD, the once mighty Western Roman Empire was crumbling into dust. The wealthy world of northern Italy was being ripped apart by barbarian invasions. Most terrifying were the Huns, who swept down from the east under Attila, leaving only ruin and terror in their wake. As their mainland cities burned, the local Roman citizens, the Veneti, had to flee for their lives. They sought refuge in the only place a mounted army could not follow: the vast, desolate lagoon on the Adriatic coast. It was no paradise. It was a hostile maze of mudflats, salt marshes, and tiny, constantly shifting islands. But it offered one unique, unparalleled virtue: safety. The shallow, intricate waterways were a natural fortress. These first Veneti were refugees, fishermen, salt makers, and farmers who had lost everything. On these tiny, muddy islands, they began to build a new kind of settlement. Their community was founded on the salt of the sea, which saved them, not the land of the mainland, which betrayed them. But how do you build a city of stone, with magnificent palaces and churches, on a foundation of soft mud? The Veneti developed an ingenious, unique method. They drove thousands of long, pointed wooden piles, often durable oak or alder, deep through the soft silt. They drove them down until they hit a hard, compressed layer of clay beneath Coranto. This created a dense, underwater forest, a stable, solid foundation. On these piles, safe beneath the oxygen-free waterline, they laid thick wooden platforms. Only then could they begin to lay the stone foundations for their houses and palaces. They were literally building a city atop an upside-down forest. The heavy, relentless thump-thump-thump of the piling hammer must have been the city's first heartbeat. This challenging environment forged a new kind of people. Their roads were canals. Their chariots were boats. Their entire existence turned toward the sea. This foundation born of fear was not destined to remain a humble refuge. It was ready to use its unique location to become a superpower. As the small lagoon settlements grew, eventually merging into a single, flourishing city centered on the Rialto Islands, the Veneti faced a new internal challenge. They were officially part of the distant Byzantine Empire, a semi-autonomous province. But in reality, they were fiercely independent. They needed a single leader to unify the islands, manage trade, and command their growing fleet. Yet, their history was one of flight from brutal tyrants and warring feudal lords on the mainland. Their deepest fear was recreating the very system of absolute rule they had run from. Their solution to this dilemma was a political masterpiece, a system that ensured an astonishing stability for a millennium. In the 8th century, they created the office of the Doge, or Duke. The title derived from the Latin dux, meaning leader. This choice was deliberate. He was to be a symbol, a leader but not a monarch, a prince but not a king. Crucially, he was elected for life by the wealthiest and most powerful families of the city. He was not born into the role. The The role was a contract to be served. The Doge's office was the symbol of the state's continuity, but his power was meticulously limited from the start. The true power in Venice lay with the wealthy merchant families. Their entire fortunes, the very reason for the city's existence, were built on maritime trade. Their greatest fear was an ambitious doge who might seize absolute power and create a hereditary dynasty, disrupting the entire commercial enterprise for personal glory. Therefore, the entire Venetian political system evolved into an intricate, ingenious, and almost paranoid machine designed to prevent exactly this. It was a republic, but it was not a democracy. It was a rigid merchant oligarchy where the business of the state was the state's business. The foundation of this system was the Great Council, Maggior Consiglio. This council consisted of the male members of all the noble, or historically ruling, families of Venice. The Great Council was the ultimate source of all power. The Doge himself, living in his magnificent palace, became a type of constitutional monarch, his every action bound by a complex and ever-reviewed oath of office, permission ducale. The checks on his power were almost obsessive. He could not name his successor. His sons were prohibited from holding public office during his reign. His official correspondence had to be opened and read by state censors before he was permitted to see it. He could not even leave the city of Venice without the express permission of his own councils. The affair of Doge Marino Faliero in the 14th century, who attempted a coup d'etat and was publicly executed, served as a chilling reminder. No single man, no matter how elevated, was greater than the Republic. To protect the state from internal threats, from overly ambitious doges, from foreign spies, and from the envy of its own merchant elite, the Venetians created one of the most famous and feared institutions in history, the Council of Ten, Consiglio dei Dieci. Established in the 14th century, this was a small, secret committee that acted as a state security apparatus with cold, often extra-legal efficiency. Its sole existential task was to root out all treason, conspiracy, and any threat to the Republic's internal stability. The Council of Ten became the invisible hand of Venice, ensuring that the appearance of La Serenissima was always maintained. The fear it instilled was a deliberate instrument of policy, a far more sophisticated form of control than an occupying army. This fear was uniquely and chillingly formalized and institutionalized. Citizens were encouraged, or perhaps subtly compelled, to anonymously denounce their neighbors, business rivals, or even family members. They did this by slipping in signed, often vague accusations into stone mailboxes placed around the city. These grim receptacles were called the Bouche de Lion, lion's mouths. These lion's mouths were typically mounted on the walls of official buildings, often carved in the shape of a lion's wide-open jaw, seemingly hungry for the populace's secrets. A citizen could approach this cold stone face, whisper a name or a concern, and drop the parchment scroll inside, knowing the letter would be conveyed, in absolute secrecy, directly to the Council of Ten. This was the cold efficiency of pure self-preservation. The very existence and operation of the Council of Ten highlighted the fundamental paradox of the Venetian system. It was a republic built on a foundation of deep, institutionalized suspicion. The rulers did not trust the Doge, the councils did not trust each other, and the state did not completely trust its own citizens. Yet this intricate web of checks, balances, and calculated suspicion was astonishingly successful. While the rest of Europe was constantly torn apart by the ambition of feudal kings and the chaos of civil war, Venice enjoyed a stability that was the envy of the world. This granite-solid foundation allowed the Republic to focus its entire formidable energy on one single passion: the accumulation of wealth and the construction of a great maritime empire. They could trade, sign treaties, and plan long-term ventures with a reliability that their rivals could only dream of. The Republic's greatest secret was not a trade route or a ship design, but its constitution itself. For the first few centuries of its existence, Venice was not fully independent. It lived in the long, magnificent shadow of the greatest and oldest power in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire. This was the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, ruling from its opulent and immensely wealthy capital, Constantinople. Venice was officially a Byzantine duchy, a faraway and semi-autonomous province. This eastern connection profoundly shaped the city's early character. Venice was a city of two worlds. Geographically, it was in the west, but its culture, architecture, art, and political outlook were decidedly looking toward the east. Venice's very survival depended on the trade flowing through the Byzantine ports. The spectacular golden mosaics that began to decorate the nascent St. Mark's Basilica were either created by Byzantine masters or done in the distinctive Byzantine style. This deep link gave the Venetians a unique and priceless advantage: access. It opened the doors to the world's most sophisticated markets, the most lucrative trade routes, and the most exotic luxuries. The Venetians were shrewd, pragmatic subjects, less concerned with flag-waving and more concerned with profit. They provided essential naval support to the Byzantine emperor, who frequently needed help against threats from Normans and Arabs. Venice provided this vital naval service, but it was a service that always came with a price. The Venetians understood that the emperor's need for their ships was a powerful bargaining chip, and they used it with cold, merchant calculation. The pivotal moment in this transactional relationship came in 1082. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was desperate for the help of the Venetian navy against a Norman invasion. In return for the service of their fleet, Alexios issued an imperial decree known as the Golden Bull Crucible. This edict granted Venetian merchants unprecedented trading privileges throughout the entire Byzantine Empire. Venetian traders were allowed to trade completely duty-free in almost every major port of the empire, including Constantinople itself. They were even given their own quarter and docks in the capital. This was a massive economic coup for Venice. It gave them a huge competitive edge over rivals like Genoa and Pisa, but it also began to economically bleed the Byzantine Empire, depriving it of vast amounts of tax revenue. The relationship began to change. The Venetian subjects were now becoming wealthier and more powerful than their own Byzantine masters. Tensions rose in hatred of the wealthy, arrogant Venetian merchants who dominated the city's commerce, boiled over into riots and massacres. The old alliance had turned into a relationship of deep suspicion and bitter economic rivalry. As Venice grew in stature and separated itself from its former Byzantine masters, its leaders knew the city needed a new spiritual heart. A great power required a great patron saint, one whose prestige could rival the apostles of Rome and the saints of Constantinople. To be truly independent, Venice needed a relic of the highest order. And so, they set their sights on the remains of Saint Mark the Evangelist himself. There was only one problem. The remains of Saint Mark were housed in a shrine in Alexandria, Egypt, a city then under the control of the Muslim Caliphate. In 828 AD, two Venetian merchants, Buono de Malamaco and Rustico de Torcello, undertook a daring and sacrilegious mission, a calculated theft of a saint. The two merchants arrived in Alexandria. Through a combination of bribery and persuasion, they convinced the shrine's keepers to let them take the saint's remains, claiming they were saving the relic from potential desecration by the local rulers. Their biggest challenge was smuggling the remains past the caliph's customs officials at the port. It was here that the merchants demonstrated the shrewdness and pragmatism that would define their republic. They placed the saint's remains in a large basket and covered them with copious layers of pork and cabbage leaves. According to the oft-repeated story, a legend the Venetians proudly etched into their history. When the Muslim officials, considering pork unclean, approached to inspect the cargo, they recoiled in disgust. They waved the ship through without a thorough check. The audacious plan had worked perfectly. The arrival of St. Mark's remains in Venice was a profoundly transformative moment. The whole city erupted in celebration. No longer a cultural province of Byzantium, Venice was now a major pilgrimage destination. Its spiritual authority could now rival Rome. The magnificent, gold-laden St. Mark's Basilica was commissioned to be the saint's new permanent home, becoming the spiritual and political heart of the Venetian state. With their new patron saint, a new symbol of power was born. The traditional emblem for Saint Mark the Evangelist is a winged lion. Venice immediately adopted this image as its own. The winged lion of Saint Mark, often depicted holding a book, became the official emblem of the Republic. The theft of a saint's remains was the ultimate declaration of Venetian ambition. It was a sacred act that severed old ties and laid a divine foundation for the independent empire to come. Venice now had a stable government, a divine patron, and a growing naval power. But what was the source of this astonishing maritime strength? The answer, the true material heart of the Republic, was forged at a single, vast, and highly secretive location: the Venice Arsenal, Arsenale di Venezia. It was not just a shipyard. It was the largest and most efficient industrial complex in Europe, centuries ahead of its time. The genius of the arsenal was its revolutionary approach to production. In an age when ships were typically built one at a time, the Venetians pioneered the principles of the modern assembly line. The process began with the mass production of standardized, interchangeable parts. Inside the arsenal's massive complex, specialized workshops were filled with highly skilled workers called the arsenalati. They focused solely on manufacturing identical components: oars, rudders, masts, and immense quantities of rope. These parts are then stored by the thousands in massive warehouses, ready for immediate use. The assembly of a ship took place along a production canal that flowed through the center of the complex. A bare, pre-built hull would be towed into the canal at one end. As it moved along the waterway, it would stop at a series of stations. At each stop, a different, specialized team of arsenalati would descend upon the vessel. They would install the specific component they had mastered. The system was so incredibly efficient that it was said a visiting dignitary once witnessed a new war galley being assembled and fully outfitted in the time it took him to eat a leisurely dinner. At the peak of its power, Venice could outfit and launch a fully equipped warship in a single day. This staggering speed gave the Republic a strategic advantage that no rival could match. In wartime, they could conjure a huge fleet almost instantly, stunning their enemies with the sheer scale and speed of their mobilization. The arsenalati were an elite and privileged class, employed by the state with lifelong jobs, pensions, and even housing. In return, they were fiercely loyal and sworn to secrecy. The arsenal was more than just a shipyard. It was the material expression of Venetian ingenuity and pragmatism. It was the factory that allowed a small city built on mud and salt water to project massive naval power across the Mediterranean. The power forged in the busy, dark halls of the arsenal was put on magnificent, dramatic display for the whole world to see on one special day each year: the Feast of the Ascension, Festa dell'Ascensa. On this day, the city celebrated its most important and unique state ritual, a sacred rite that perfectly captured the soul of the Republic. It was called the Marriage of the Sea, Sposalizio del Mar. The centerpiece of the festival was the Doge's state barge, the Bucentoro. This was no warship. It was a floating palace, a stunning work of architecture and craftsmanship. The massive vessel, propelled by the skilled rowers of the arsenal, had its entire surface covered in mythological carvings and was covered in pure gold leaf. On the morning of the festival, the Doge, dressed in his finest ceremonial robes, would board the Bucentoro with the highest officials and foreign ambassadors. From there, he led a huge procession of hundreds of boats out onto the lagoon. It was a scene of immense solemnity and civic pride. The destination of the procession was the Lido entrance, the point where the quiet waters of the lagoon met the open expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Here, the flotilla would fall silent, and the Doge would perform the ancient, sacred rite. He would hold aloft a consecrated gold ring. He would then utter the solemn, unchanging Latin vow, De sponsimus timere in signum veri perpetuique dominii. The translation of this vow was a colossal political declaration. We wed thee, our sea, as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. With those words, he dropped the gold ring into the waves, sealing the contract between the city and the ocean. This act was the annual renewal of the core sacred covenant of the city's existence. It was a prayer for the safety of their sailors and the prosperity of their trade. But it was also a resounding statement of political fact. It declared to the world that the Adriatic was Venetian territory, their own private highway, and that they were its undisputed masters. To the Venetians, the sea was their fortress and their entire reason for being. This magnificent ceremony was the ultimate expression of the Venetian soul. At the dawn of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III proclaimed the Fourth Crusade, a new holy war to sail to the Holy Land. Feudal lords from France and the Holy Roman Empire answered the call. But to attack the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, they needed a fleet. Only one city in the world could supply it: Venice. The leader of Venice at this time was one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages, Doge Enrico Dandolo. He was an old man, well into his 90s, and he was blind. Yet, his mind was as sharp as any man half his age, and his ambition for the glory of Venice was boundless. The Crusader envoys arrived and made their request. They needed a fleet to transport a massive force: 33,500 men and 4,500 horses. Dandolo and the Venetians drove a hard bargain. They agreed to suspend all their normal trading activities for over a year. They would dedicate the entire industrial might of the arsenal to this monumental project. The price for this service was a staggering sum: 85,000 silver marks. The Crusaders agreed, and Venice set to work. In the summer of 1202, the Crusader army arrived at the Lido of Venice. A crisis immediately erupted. The army was far smaller than promised. Thousands of knights had taken other routes or simply dropped out. Consequently, they could only pay a fraction of the immense agreed-upon price. The situation was a disaster for both sides. A massive, armed foreign army was now stranded on an island in the lagoon, unable to fulfill its holy vow, and Venice was on the brink of bankruptcy, its expensive new fleet lying idle in port. It was in this moment of crisis that the blind Doge Dandolo revealed his cunning genius. He made a proposition to the desperate Crusaders. He suggested they could pay off the remainder of their debt, not in silver, but in service. Their first objective, he announced, would not be Egypt. It would be the Catholic city of Zara, a Venetian trade rival on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders were horrified. They had taken a holy oath to fight the enemies of Christ. Now, they were being asked to attack a fellow Christian city for the commercial benefit of Venice. Many protested this blatant co-opting of their sacred mission. Some abandoned the crusade in disgust, but the vast majority, trapped by their debt and desperation, reluctantly agreed. To seal the deal, the elderly Enrico Dandolo performed a piece of masterful political theater. At a grand mass in St. Mark's Basilica, he announced that he himself, despite his age and blindness, would personally take the cross and lead the crusade. The great fleet, paid for by Venetian silver and Crusader desperation, finally set sail. Dandolo's great gamble had succeeded. He had diverted the entire Fourth Crusade onto a new, unforeseen, and controversial path, replacing its holy purpose with the cold, hard logic of Venetian ambition. In the autumn of 1202, the great Venetian and Crusader fleet appeared before the ramparts of Zara. The people of the city hung crosses and papal banners from their walls. They begged the Crusaders not to attack their fellow Christians. The Pope himself had explicitly forbidden the action and threatened the entire army with excommunication. But the leaders of the crusade were bound by their debt, and the blind Doge Dandolo was implacable. For Venice, this was business. After a brief and brutal assault, the city of Zara fell to the Crusader army. The army settled in the conquered city for the winter. It was during this cold, tense winter that the fate of the crusade changed forever. A new player arrived. He was an exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. He made a spectacular offer to the Crusader leaders. He asked them to sail to Constantinople and help him seize the throne. In return, he would pay off all of their debts to Venice, fund their continued journey to Egypt, and submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. For the Venetians, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Constantinople was Venice's greatest trade rival. The chance to place a friendly, indebted emperor on its throne was a prize that Enrico Dandolo was willing to risk everything for. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the great, legendary walls of Constantinople. The initial attack was a success. The usurper on the throne fled. The young Prince Alexios was installed as co-emperor, but the victory was short-lived. The new emperor quickly found that the city's treasury was empty. He could not pay the vast sums he had promised. Tensions exploded. The Crusader army felt betrayed. A popular revolt overthrew and murdered their puppet emperor. With no hope of payment, the Crusaders and the Venetians made a fateful decision. They would take payment by force. In April 1204, they launched a full-scale assault. The Venetian fleet played a critical role, their ships acting as floating siege towers. After a desperate battle, the defenses were breached. The Crusader army poured into the wealthiest city in the Christian world. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in medieval history, the Great Sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the city suffered an orgy of looting, destruction, and killing. Palaces and churches were stripped of priceless relics and ancient treasures. Venice played a cunning and calculated game in the division of the spoils. The French knights took land, but Venice took the prizes that mattered most to a maritime empire. They seized the 4 famous bronze horses, a future symbol for St. Mark's Basilica. They won control of 3/8 ths of the city of Constantinople itself, and they claimed a chain of strategic ports and islands across the Byzantine Empire, including the crucial, strategic island of Crete, Candia. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Instead, it smashed the ancient Christian Byzantine Empire. It also enriched Venice beyond its wildest dreams. With the wealth of Constantinople in their vaults and the most strategic ports under their control, Venice was no longer merely a powerful city-state. It was now a true empire, the undisputed master of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the chaotic aftermath of the sacking of Constantinople, the Venetians played a much more strategic and commercial game than the other feudal lords. Their ambition was not for land, but for the sea itself. From the spoils of the collapsed empire, they manufactured a new kind of empire perfectly suited for a republic of merchants, the Stato de Mar, the sea state. Their strategy was to create a continuous chain of fortified ports and islands that acted as stepping stones. It was a maritime highway that stretched from the Venetian lagoon all the way to the Black Sea. It was a string of pearls, where each pearl was a strategic harbor, a naval base, and a trading outpost. This ensured the safety and supremacy of Venetian shipping. From the partition of the Byzantine Empire, Venice acquired a host of critical locations, including ports along the Greek coastline and the Cyclades Islands. But their greatest prize was the large and strategically vital island of Crete, which the Venetians called the Kingdom of Candia. Crete became their most important overseas colony, allowing them to dominate the shipping lanes of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. This Stato de Mar was not a colonial empire of settlement. It was a commercial and military machine. Every island and every port served a specific purpose. They were safe havens where Venetian merchant galleys could rest, resupply, and shelter from storms and pirates. They were naval stations where Venetian war squadrons could be garrisoned. This allowed them to police the sea lanes and project power far from home. The rule in these colonies was often a pragmatic, business-like form of governance. It was more concerned with collecting taxes and ensuring the smooth, uninterrupted flow of trade than with changing local culture. The Stato de Mar was the ultimate expression of the Venetian worldview. It was an empire designed by merchants for merchants. This network of naval bases and trading points was the hard skeleton that supported their vast commercial body. It allowed them to control the flow of wealth from the east back to their home city with unparalleled efficiency and security. The Venetian empire of ports and islands was designed to funnel the wealth of the east toward the west. But the journey of one Venetian went deeper beyond the familiar trade routes, all the way to the very source of that wealth. His name was Marco Polo, and his story would become the most famous travelogue in history. The adventure began in 1271. Marco, then just a 17-year-old boy, set out from Venice with his father and uncle. This was no quick sea voyage, but a long, grueling overland journey, following the legendary network of paths known as the Silk Road. For 3.5 years, they traversed the harsh mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Persia, and the mighty Pamirs. Finally, they reached their destination, the opulent, almost mythical court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China. The Khan was fascinated by these strange men from a distant land. He took a particular liking to the young Marco Polo, finding him intelligent and a keen observer. For the next 17 years, Marco Polo did not just trade. He became a trusted ambassador/administrator for the Great Khan. He was sent on official missions all over the vast empire, witnessing and recording wonders that stunned the European worldview. He saw the systematic use of paper money and the common use of coal as a fuel source. He gained a privileged view of the logistical complexities and administrative genius required to govern an empire of that size. Years passed. Finally, the chance to return came when the Khan needed a safe escort for a Mongol princess to Persia. The Polos, now middle-aged men, were reluctantly permitted to leave by the Khan. After a perilous 2-year sea voyage, they finally returned to Venice in 1295, 24 years after they had set out. 3 years later, captured in a naval war against the rival Genoa, Marco Polo found himself in a Genoese prison. It was there that he dictated the incredible story of his travels to a fellow prisoner, Rusticolo de Pisa. The resulting book was known as Il Milione, The Million Lies, a name that referred to the skepticism of the Venetian public towards stories that were simply too grand, too alien. Yet, despite the disbelief, the book became an immediate bestseller. It provided Europe with its first concrete descriptions of China, Cathay, Japan, Cipangu, and the Spice Islands. It was more than a travelogue. It was a commercial manifesto, an economic spur that would directly inspire later explorers, including Columbus, to seek a western sea route to the resources Marco Polo had described. Luxury trade was the financial cornerstone of Venice, and at the heart of that trade was spice. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were not just flavorings. They were a concentrated form of wealth. They were preservatives, medicine, and a public expression of status. Venice's immense wealth was built on the ruthless, total control of the supply of these high-value goods in Europe. They were the undisputed kings of spice. The mechanism of this control was a stroke of state-sponsored commercial genius. Venice controlled the entire supply chain, from the eastern sources to the European distributors. The transport of these goods was handled by the state-run Mud system. The Mud were large, state-organized, heavily armed merchant convoys that sailed on fixed schedules to the east. The system was designed to minimize risk, maximize efficiency, and, most importantly, prevent competition. By centralizing shipping in state-controlled convoys, Venice could maintain high prices, regulate volume, and guarantee the security of its precious cargo. When the spices arrived in Venice, they were offloaded and stored in massive warehouses. The city enforced strict laws against independent shipping. When it came time to sell the goods to the Central European merchants, the Germans, the French, the English, the Venetian traders simply held an absolute monopoly. The only way to get actual cinnamon or pepper into Europe was to buy it at exorbitant markups from a Venetian. This spice monopoly created an immense concentration of wealth within the city's nobility. Their homes were not just houses. They were fondaci, palace, warehouse, and bank combined. This prosperity was evident in their architecture. Venetian architecture from this period was a gorgeous synthesis of Western Gothic and Eastern Byzantine detail. The palaces along the Grand Canal seemed to float, made of lace and light, reflected in the shimmering water. However, this commercial domination led to a long, brutal conflict with their primary maritime rival, Genoa. The rivalry escalated into four major wars. The most decisive and frightening was the War of Chioggia, 1378 to 1381. This war brought Venice to the brink of total annihilation. The Genoese fleet penetrated the very Venetian lagoon and captured the strategic port of Chioggia. The city was under siege, but Doge Contarini and Admiral Vetter Pisani mounted a desperate counterattack. They blockaded the Genoese fleet inside the lagoon. After 6 tense months, the trapped Genoese forces were forced to surrender. Venice had survived, cementing its dominance in the east and eliminating its most dangerous naval rival. The golden age of Venice was profoundly threatened by a new, larger menace: the relentless rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were not a competing city-state. They were a formidable land-based imperial machine, with ambitions to control all the land bridges connecting Europe and Asia. The Great Shock came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. The Byzantine capital fell to the armies of Sultan Mehmed II. This collapse was a psychological and commercial disaster for Venice. It eliminated the last great Christian buffer state in the east and placed the Ottomans directly on the doorstep of the Stato de March. The relationship between Venice and the Ottomans became a protracted, costly struggle in blood and money. Venice adopted a pragmatic and often cynical policy. While their fleets were fighting the Ottomans at sea to protect their colonies, their diplomats and merchants were simultaneously at the Sultan's court, attempting to sign new trade treaties. They understood that war was ruinous, but commerce, even with the enemy, was the only way to pay for it. Slowly, the Stato de Mar's string of pearls was lost. The island of Cyprus fell to the Ottomans in 1571. The costly, 2-decade-long, heroic defense of Crete, the Kingdom of Candia, finally ended with the island's surrender in 1669. Each loss was a massive blow to Venice's prestige, naval power, and commercial income. However, the final, fatal blow to Venice's commercial supremacy came not from an army, but from a sudden, irreversible shift in global geography, the age of exploration. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut, India. He had found the source of the spices. For Venice, this was catastrophic. Their wealth was based on their absolute monopoly as the middleman. Now, the Portuguese could sail directly from Lisbon to India, load up on spices, and sail straight back to Europe, completely bypassing the entire costly and perilous Venetian-controlled supply chain. When the first Portuguese ships carrying cheap pepper arrived in Lisbon, the price of pepper in Europe immediately plummeted. Venetian profits, the lifeblood of the Republic, evaporated almost overnight. Their economic model was broken. The city was forced to make a painful pivot, turning its attention back to the Italian mainland, terra firma, the very land its ancestors had fled. It transitioned from a dynamic maritime empire to a wealthy but regional territorial state, a complete reversal of its founding principles. The final 2 centuries of the Venetian Republic were marked by a profound, beautiful, and melancholy retreat. Venice, having lost its commercial dominance and most of its empire, made one last strategic decision. It would transform itself from a global power into the world's most luxurious, neutral city-state. The Republic entered its phase of the long, beautiful sleep. Its focus shifted from aggressive trade to sophisticated diplomacy and, most famously, spectacle. The city became a magnet for wealthy European aristocracy. Foreign visitors flocked to Venice not to do business, but to see art, gamble at the famous casinos, Radati, and above all, to partake in the legendary, hedonistic atmosphere of the carnival. Carnival became the ultimate expression of the city's character. It was a season of sanctioned chaos, where the use of mass cheer was mandatory. These masks allowed nobles, commoners, and courtesans to mingle anonymously, blurring the rigid class lines. The entire city became one vast, glittering theater, a land of fantasy that masked the grim political reality of decline. The art of this final era perfectly captured the mood. Artists like Canaletto created precise, brilliant cityscapes, essentially exquisite, beautiful postcards for tourists, a celebration of the city's stunning architecture, which was now more a museum than a commercial hub. The government, the councils, and the Doge's palace continued to operate with the cold, painstaking procedure established a millennium earlier, but their authority was now largely an illusion. The old system, designed for a period of aggressive empire building, was now focused entirely on neutrality and survival. The final, inevitable end came not with a siege, but with a whimper. In 1797, the revolutionary French army of Napoleon Bonaparte swept into northern Italy. The old, rigid political apparatus of the Republic, built on centuries of caution, was too inflexible to adapt to the speed and fury of the Napoleonic age. Doge Ludovico Manin, the final Doge, voted with the Great Council to peacefully dissolve the Republic rather than face a military invasion and the destruction of the city. On May 12, 1797, the Doge performed his last duty, laying down his cap, corno ducale, as the French raised the revolutionary tricolor flag in St. Mark's Square. The 1,000-year-old Serenissima had died a bloodless, almost bureaucratic death. Yet, in its final act of self-preservation, Venice preserved itself. Napoleon conquered the state, but he could not destroy the city. Today, Venice remains the most perfect artifact of a unique world that ever existed, a spectacular monument to the sheer audacity, ingenuity, and extraordinary determination of a people who chose to build their home where no civilization should have stood. The city, though sinking, remains the most eloquent testament to the power of a merchant republic that married the sea and, for one glorious millennium, kept its vow.